Some questions that patients often have for their clinicians is, I have this result, what does it mean? This result is concerning to me. So having large language models, again, sort of are tangentially already taking a stab at this by creating these first drafts. So when a patient says, oh, I'm concerned, it looks like I am positive for hepatitis B, the large language model will say, you know what? You're actually positive for hepatitis B surface antibody. And there's no need for any concern because it actually shows that you're immunized for hepatitis B.
Welcome to the People of Pathology podcast. I'm Dennis Strank. On this podcast, we explore pathology, laboratory medicine, forensic science, and new technologies in these fields. We've all heard of ChatGPT, and you probably know it's based on large language models. Today, my guests are Dr. Simone Arvisais-Anhalt and Dr. Daniel Qazi. They've worked with large language models in pathology and laboratory medicine. From generating text to analyzing data, we explore the benefits and challenges of implementing LLMs in clinical practice. All right, let's get into it with Dr. Simone Arvisais-Anhalt and Dr. Daniel Qazi. A lot of what we're going to talk about today is using large language models in pathology in different applications. And you've both done quite a bit of work in this area. But before we get into that, let's get a little context about both of you. So I'm curious if you could each kind of tell me your sort of origin story. Like, how did you become interested in pathology?
Yeah, sure. I can start with that. So I, similar to, I feel like many people in pathology, came to it relatively late in the game. I went throughout my medical school really liking everything, but realizing that I didn't have one distinct passion for any field like a lot of my medical school colleagues did. So when I was on OB/GYN, I loved the patient interactions. I loved the experience. But when I turned to my colleagues who were just like, this is what I eat, breathe, I didn't feel that with one specialty, which left me a little bit concerned towards the end of my third year. But my institution graciously set together an alumni event where they were recruiting everyone from different specialties. So when I went to that event, I made a point to sit with anyone who is representing a specialty that I had not rotated with and happened to just closest in proximity to me, see that a pathologist was sitting there at a table and said, oh, pathology is not one that I'm going to rotate with. So it was certainly something that was just a fortuitous experience that it was a pathologist who was in closest proximity to me at this alumni event that I ended up sitting down next to and ended up staying with for the rest of the night, and was just very impressed with what I thought was a great opportunity to almost have another chance at medical school where you have this breadth and depth of exposure, where you're cross-secting basically all fields in medicine. And I sort of like the scale as well. You're really, in data science, we call it a one-to-many relationship. You're, as one pathologist, having a huge relationship with so many different clinicians and patients. So that was very motivating to me.
Okay, that makes sense. So there was this conversation with this pathologist that kind of made the decision for you, or was there like later on, was there, people often have like this moment where they go, okay, yes, this is it. This is how I know. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think it was actually the sort of the scale, and then again that one to many. So when I was on surgery, when I was on OB/GYN, I was like, wow, I will really be focusing on this one thing for the rest of my life. That's great, but I just don't have that same passion. But I feel like pathology, again, since we work with so many different patients, so many different clinicians, I think it was more so changing the scale and the scope of the practice. That was like, that is for me. Having it framed that way was really what made it click for me. And as a pathologist, I practice more on the clinical pathology side of things. So I think it's even more true in the clinical pathology world that I'm dealing with thousands of patients a day.
Sure. That makes sense. Okay, Dr. Qazi, how about you?
Yeah, thanks for that, Simone, because I actually relate to that idea of not being committed to any one thing. I think I liked everything. So for me, my story actually starts with college because I no one in my family is a physician, and I ended up just going to medical school because I didn't know what else to do. Honestly, it was just sort of, it seemed like a professional career, and it just seemed like something that did sort of, I guess, meaningful work. And so I wasn't sure what I was getting myself into from the start. And then once I got into it, I thought I was going to go into surgery. I liked working with my hands, and I just figured it's, you see immediate results. And so, but then I got to my third year rotations and I did my surgery rotation and I loved it. I really enjoyed it, but it was a little bit too much for me. Honestly, I sort of had to do some deep thinking. I asked myself, could I do this for the rest of my life, the next 50 years of my life? And I was like, probably not, but I could do it. But would I be happy? I think I answered no there. So then I thought I'd pivot to interventional radiology. And so I took a research year in between my third and fourth year medical school. And I was doing some MRI research at Yale. And I realized halfway through my research year, I was doing some image analysis stuff. And I sort of went down this rabbit hole on PubMed one day and getting into sort of image analysis, automated techniques, data science. And I started realizing that I loved it. And I taught myself how to code, took statistics courses, calculus courses, just brushing up on the math and getting into machine learning. And so then I realized, my niche was really building systems. I think that's sort of what I find most interesting, is being involved in sort of high level processes like that. And so then I realized that actually, out of all the fields in medicine, pathology has the most data. And so that was sort of for me the decision point. And so then it was a very late decision, but I decided to pivot to pathology.
Okay, then, and we're going to get into kind of how you both got into clinical informatics, but it sounds like for you, that was sort of part of the equation from the beginning, right?
Yes, exactly.
Okay. And then back to you, Dr. Arvisais-Anhalt, as far as the clinical informatics piece, how did that come into play for you?
Yeah, that was sort of in parallel for me. I entered medical school having, in undergrad, had experience with mathematical modeling and programming from some research I was doing in ecology. I was working on that as I was leaving undergrad, and I was surprised by, I was interested in the field, but I was surprised by how much I liked programming and how much it was a shift in almost my worldview in terms of how to solve problems. And when I was finishing up that project and that research experience, I remember thinking like, oh, well, that's a shame that I'll never revisit this again because this is really interesting. And I transitioned over to medical school. But once you have an understanding of how systems work and once you know programming, it's sort of hard to turn it off. So I remember very early on in my medical school education, just being completely flummoxed by patients coming to our tertiary care hospital from outlying community hospitals with a binder on their chest, even though we were on Epic, this other community hospital was on Epic, but they still had to come with paper records to get a complete story. So this was earlier on where interoperability sort of across the nation, it is still being worked on, but was certainly in infancy at the time. But it was just those types of questions where I felt like my colleagues were like, this is just the way it is. But having, again, some understanding of programming, computer science, how systems work, I was like, this is totally surmountable. How is it the case that we aren't on top of this right now? Then you learn more about clinical informatics and you realize how complicated the landscape is. But it was just one of those things where the questions that I was asking of my peers and my attendings when I was a medical student, they all sort of ended up being sort of magnetically pulled back to informatics related concepts. I didn't know that at the time, but it actually wasn't until I started identifying that I wanted to go into pathology. Since informatics has been such a longstanding part of pathology, we were one of the earliest adopters of computing technology. We were one of the earliest supporters of clinical informatics as a specialty in medicine. It was when I was learning more about pathology that I learned about pathology informatics. And I was like, oh, this totally makes sense. With a background in mathematical modeling, going into more clinical pathology, and again, working at that scale, it was just sort of all coalescing. So I was late to pathology, but I would say early to pathology informatics. So I entered residency saying, I'm going to study pathology, or I'm going to pursue pathology, and I'm going to do clinical informatics fellowship, which I ultimately pursued at UCSF, and then have since stayed on as faculty and am currently the director of lab medicine informatics at UCSF.
I feel like, especially these days, like having some knowledge of informatics, if you're a pathologist or becoming a pathologist, it's almost required now, right? What do you both think of that?
Yeah, when I'm teaching trainees, I've had the opportunity to set up a clinical informatics rotation more focused on pathology informatics. But what I tell trainees that I work with is not everyone's going to be as interested or as sort of finely attuned to all the informatics issues that I'm working on, but everyone will have to deal with informatics in some capacity. So I feel like it's my responsibility as faculty to make sure that you understand the currency of informatics that will make you successful in your clinical practice, because everyone has to know something about it. So it's just trying to figure out, I guess, to what depth, but I totally agree with your statement that it's absolutely, everyone needs to know something about informatics these days, whether they like it or not.
Yeah, I totally echo Simone's sentiment. I mean, even if it's as simple as having, a diagram with 2 arrows and 3 boxes, showing you what a server is and, just sort of, it can be that simple. But yeah, I think there's definitely a spectrum of interest and understanding, so people like Simone and I are very interested in maybe some of the intricacies and, again, learning some details. But I think even the most basic level informatics will be required for all future pathologists, down the road.
Sure. That makes sense. All right. Before we get into talking about the paper, I mean, it deals with using large language models, or LLMs, in pathology. And I kind of want to define that. I guess probably most people are aware of what this is, but if they're not, let's talk about what is an LLM and how does it work?
So, large language models, they are a type of artificial intelligence that can recognize and generate text, among other things. They're trained on huge sets of data, which is why they're called large language models. And they're built on a type of neural network called a transformer model. So that's the T in GPT. Basically, what large language models do is that given an input of text, large language models, they can extract meanings from the text, they can understand the relationships between words that are in text, and then they use this information to generate an output by predicting words that are most likely to come given the input. So on ChatGPT, for example, you input text, and then through complex mathematics, basically the output is predictions of the words that are most likely to come next given the input text that was given to the model.
Okay, that's a good definition. Okay. All right. So the paper is called Establishing Priorities for Implementation of Large Language Models in Pathology and Laboratory Medicine. And in this paper, you mentioned some of the benefits of using LLMs. And I want to talk about a few of those because they're pretty fascinating. So the first one, you give an example of a pathologist using ChatGPT to create sort of an outline of a presentation. Let's talk about this. How does this work?
Yeah, so from this paper where we were proposing use cases that we had generated ourselves and also we're just learning in the community of these use cases, making drafts is something that I think many people are excited to get almost a thought partner from something like a large language model. So, for example, if you're creating a presentation or you have to come up with an outline for something, I think most people, when they are starting a creative activity like that, you're generating something from scratch. Starting with a blank page in front of you or a blank PowerPoint is fairly daunting. So, what we were proposing and what we are also now studying in terms of how people are using large language models, even in our department, creating a presentation outline is a great first start to get that draft to get you going. So, if you have a topic of interest and you know that you have to create, I think in the paper we use an example of you are going to be giving a presentation to medical students on maybe a certain type of anemia.
Mm-hmm.
You can say, hey, ChatGPT, I'm going to be giving a presentation on this topic to this audience. Can you help me generate an outline to get started? And just using that as a thought partner, getting something on a blank page to get you at least from 0% to some percent beyond that. And then using it as a tool to iteratively keep working on a final product ultimately. So we were proposing that using it as that type of thought partner to get you started on something like a presentation or a paper would be a good application in the field of pathology.
Okay, I like this for two reasons. Like you were saying, looking at the blank sheet of paper or the blank PowerPoint and trying to start somewhere is hard to do. So now you've got sort of a starting point. But the other part of it is it's not a finished presentation. It's just the outline, and then you edit it and fill it in, with your own kind of thoughts. So it's the point I'm trying to get to poorly is it's instead of, I like to say, instead of AI being artificial intelligence, it's augmented intelligence. And I think this is an example of that. It helps to augment your abilities so you can make a presentation or write a paper even faster.
Exactly. And I think different people identify being stronger or weaker at different types of writing exercises. So I think that it's been interesting to hear people who self-identify as being poor writers of, for example, letters of recommendation. Oh, the style is too formal. It feels a little artificial relative to how I usually write. Again, it's great to have a thought partner where you say, I'm going to write it in my style, and then ask the chat GPT, can you make this more formal? And then even though it may not seem natural to you, given just like the decorum of that style of writing, it's nice to have, again, a thought partner that can augment, as you were saying, your own abilities. And especially if you sort of understand your strengths and weaknesses, it's nice to have something to help you when you have identified something that you don't feel particularly confident in or strong in as a sort of writing, as a writing partner.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. Another example in there is a benefit in data analysis. And I feel like this would be particularly relevant in research. So let's talk about this. How are LLMs useful in data analysis?
It's a really, really good question. And I guess I want to maybe break it down, data analysis. So there's really, broadly speaking, two types of data, qualitative and quantitative. And I think the easier one to explain will be qualitative. It sort of fits with what a large language model does already. So, I'm laughing, and maybe Simone can tell you why I'm laughing. But one example of using ChatGPT or any sort of large language model for qualitative data analysis is sort of maybe asking it to do a thematic analysis, asking it to sort of deconstruct an interview, a focus group, things like that. And sort of, again, not relying completely on the large language model to give you the results. Again, it's an augmentation, so there requires some manual review, but it can sort of speed you up an order of magnitude. So again, if you have a block of text that's qualitative, asking the model to give you some sort of output that you want, that maybe you don't want to necessarily spend hours and hours trying to do initially. So again, just cutting down a little bit of your work. So that's for qualitative data. For quantitative data, it's sort of interesting, and this will improve over time. What you can do currently, you could ask ChatGPT, for example, I have two categorical variables, or I have two, quantitative or continuous variables. What is the best statistical method or model to look for statistical significance, right? And it could give you that output, telling you with some pretty good degree of accuracy currently which models to use or which methods to use, and then actually even beyond that, these models are now outputting code. So you may not be someone who's very experienced with R or Python. So your first question might be, okay, which, should I use a t-test, or, what should I do? And it might give you an answer. And then what you could do, if you're so inclined, you could say, oh, could you provide me the Python code or R code to do this? And it will do that. And so this is, again, just speeding you up orders of magnitude. It takes someone who's a complete novice and they can make them an intermediate pretty quickly. That being said, the caveats to all of this are accuracy, precision, again, the hallucinations, which we'll talk about. These are all caveats, and there's ways to address these things, but I think that's why you'll always need a human in the loop for the foreseeable future. And just being trained on how to do these things will be very helpful, I think. So, but that's sort of how I see how these models helping with data analysis.
Okay, I got it. That makes a lot of sense. That's like really fascinating stuff. I think in the paper, probably the best example, or the one that, let's say it's my favorite example, you give using an LLM to kind of translate a pathology report into language the patient can understand. And this, I can see a real need for this. The way that you describe it in the paper is super interesting. So let's talk about this. Like, how does this work?
Yeah, so that was another proposed use case that we were pretty excited about to discuss among ourselves as co-authors. And then I know in the pathology informatics community, there's been a lot of discussion about this. But basically, taking into consideration that I think across the United States, it's well documented that clinicians oftentimes overestimate the medical literacy and, quite frankly, just literacy that patients have. And we don't write to a level that is representative, quite frankly, of the, again, medical literacy and literacy of our patient populations across the United States. Oftentimes in pathology, I think we have identified ourselves. I know we tongue-in-cheek say we're the doctor's doctor, oftentimes communicating to other clinicians. So when we're making our anatomic pathology reports or doing any type of interpretive work in the clinical pathology world, we think that we are generating these diagnoses for other clinicians to then explain it to their patients. But with huge paradigm shifts in terms of, for example, the 21st Century Cures Act, where now patients are receiving their laboratory results sometimes before their clinician is seeing them, and certainly reviewing them before they've had the opportunity to review it with their clinician. I think given the externalities of this, such as documented increases in in-basket messaging from patients to clinicians about their pathology results, it's worth pausing and considering how we as pathologists could change our communication strategies, knowing that our audience isn't pretty much exclusively clinicians anymore. So what we were excited about is how large language models can quite easily take text, and as I described earlier, you can make text from more casual language to more formal language, also using large language models to change the level of difficulty in explaining a concept. So explain this at a level to discuss with a pathology assistant or a pathologist. Explain this at a level to discuss with a high schooler or a middle schooler, or even how would you explain this diagnosis to an elementary student or someone who is not speaking English as their first language. So how can we take this text that historically we have used to communicate with predominantly other clinicians and then instead explain it into a more patient-friendly and interpretable fashion? And I know that this is sort of tangentially being addressed with some other large language model pilots that are impacting more ambulatory physicians. Many sites are now piloting large language models, teeing up responses to patient messages, say through in-basket, which would be, I guess, the epic speak for that. So as patients are messaging, in-basket messaging their clinicians, large language models are being used to tee up first drafts. And some questions that patients often have for their clinicians is, I have this result, what does it mean? This result is concerning to me. So having large language models, again, sort of are tangentially already taking a stab at this by creating these first drafts. So when a patient says, oh, I'm concerned, it looks like I am positive for hepatitis B, the large language model will say, you know what? You're actually positive for hepatitis B surface antibody, and there's no need for any concern because it actually shows that you're immunized for hepatitis B. So congratulations, you're immunized. There's no need for concern, and we're looking forward to seeing you the next time you come to our clinic. So yes, a lot to go there.
Okay, I like this. It would eliminate a lot of confusion, misunderstanding, things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And there have been studies since the 21st Century Cures Act showing that patients really do actually like receiving their results, but they do at times also create a lot of anxiety. So trying to figure out how we can make sure that we are harnessing the full power of patients receiving this information.
Okay, that's really interesting. One thing I wanted to cover, because when there's any sort of new technology, whether it's in pathology or probably any other field, there's always a question of like, okay, how long is it going to take me to get used to learning this? And I think for both of you coming in with a programming background and an informatics background, that's probably not an issue. But even if we're talking about Chat GPT, I've used it a little bit. It's pretty easy to use. So it seems like that's not really a problem here. Like if you're talking about large language models, and sort of the best example is Chat GPT, there's really isn't much of a learning curve, right?
Yeah, this is another great question. I would agree with that, relatively speaking, just as maybe like a comparison. So SQL was a database language or technology, and it's pretty, I think if you're not familiar with programming, it is kind of technical. It has a specific jargon. And so to get a good understanding of databases, and if you want to sort of move things around in a database yourself, yeah, it's pretty technical, and it would take you, a couple weeks to a month to really learn it. And, so if that's sort of where we were before, I mean, I completely agree. These large language models, they sort of outsource a lot of that technical work for you. So you can just ask it to sort of do these queries, or at least give you the code to do the queries. And so, yeah, I think overall, definitely less of a learning curve. That being said, I would still say that, it's not like there's no learning curve. So what I mean by that is that I think what we found, Simone, and this is actually based on the study that we just conducted, it's actually harder to ask the right question than you think. So I feel as if this concept of, I don't know, maybe folks have heard of it, prompt engineering, or coming up with the right prompt to ask these large language models. It's a little bit more difficult than I think people might think. So it goes back to a little bit of what I was talking about earlier about being able to ask the right question. So it's not just that you can ask a question and just trust the output. You have to know how to ask the question, because these models, again, they're probabilistic, and so they may give you answers. They may just be inaccurate answers, but they may give you answers that are sort of believable, but because you didn't ask the question in the right way, it sort of went on a little tangent. But if you rephrase your question, it will come back around. And so I think that's the learning curve here, is really, it's this sort of, I think this in this space or this industry or whatever you want to call it is called human machine interface or human computer interface, right? And so I think this is an area of really deep study right now in the computer science world, is sort of how do humans talk to machines or interact with machines. And so, yeah, the learning curve is definitely lessened, but it's still there, and it's just in a different way now. And so I think going forward, maybe some broad outlines or even specific prompts or ways to interact with this technology would be helpful.
Yeah, and if I can add to that, the way I've been describing this next sort of iteration of technology, back in the 90s, there was command line programming. So if you wanted to be using a computer in the early 90s, you were getting into your terminal and doing command line programming, which is so daunting to the non-technical person.
Yep.
The next iteration after that made computers more accessible was graphical user interfaces. So instead of basically recreating Excel through command line programming, there was Excel, which has cells and numbers or different data go in cells. So that made technology, the software, more accessible to users through the graphical user interface. It was a little bit more intuitive to use it. And I think large language models is sort of the next iteration of usability, especially as different companies such as Microsoft, which released Copilot for things like Excel, instead of just having the graphical user interface for Excel, using your own natural language, saying, I know I need to sort this column. I don't know how to do it. So I'm just going to write in a text field, sort column B, and then it does it. So if you are a savvier user of Excel, you may know the functions or what to click on that. But since everyone comes with different levels of technology proficiency, being able to ask the question and command the software to do something in your own language, the way that you're thinking about it, and then having it fairly reproducibly be able to execute on that, with caveats being the prompt engineering, as Dan mentioned. It's sort of like the next iteration of usability, but then it comes with its own issues, as Dan mentioned, such as I don't think most people are used to using a software and then getting variable outputs. So you can ask it the same thing 5 different times and it could give you 5 different responses. So it's just a matter of really understanding how the system works to the extent to be able to reliably understand what the output is and when you should trust it and when you shouldn't trust it. So I think that's sort of that's part of the learning curve that needs to be adjusted for.
This is the People of Pathology podcast with our guests, Dr. Simone Arvisais-Anhalt and Dr. Daniel Qazi. We'll be right back. If you think it would be nice to have a helpful reference about digital pathology, I have some great news for you. Dr. Alexander Zhurov has written a book called Digital Pathology 101. All you need to know to start and continue your digital pathology journey. This book will help you whether you're a complete novice or a digital pathology trailblazer. You can get a copy of it by following the link in the show notes. LabVine is an interactive online learning platform where laboratory professionals learn, develop, and discover by sharing knowledge and building on each other's experience. The platform provides global access to internationally accredited laboratory-specific courses and other resources developed by lab specialists, like us, for the laboratory industry. LabVine is free to sign up, and you can use the link in the show notes to get started. Now for the rest of my conversation with Dr. Qazi and Dr. Arvisais-Anhalt on the People of Pathology podcast. Being able to ask the correct prompt, that seems like one of the potential challenges of using LLMs. And you mentioned a few of those in the paper as well. And I think, Dr. Qazi, you alluded to one of them also, the hallucination being another one. So let's talk about some of the potential challenges, and let's start with hallucination and kind of explain what we mean by that.
Yeah. So kind of like what Simone was saying earlier, these large language models, they are probabilistic. So they're not, it's tricky. I think when we throw around words a lot, I think if you asked a computer scientist or a pure statistician, they would say that actually these current models, they don't necessarily have an understanding like humans do. Well, what they're doing is, again, it's just sort of pattern recognition, and it's just a lot of data. So it's not as if they have an idea of what causality is, or sort of they're just sort of, again, filling in the next word based on probabilities. And so it's a little bit different than what we're doing, but it looks great. It looks great on, in terms of the output. So what these hallucinations are is sort of, it's this probabilistic failure, right? So it's rather than it, again, if it had an understanding, these hallucinations wouldn't really be happening. But what it's doing is it's, the next word or the next, we'll just say sentence or paragraphs that it comes up with, it may go down this weird rabbit hole of probabilities. So it finds, again, we're not getting into the details of the math here, but it will essentially start coming up with probabilities that are not really relevant to your question. And so it may just start making up data. It may be completely made up, right? And so this is a big problem in healthcare, or really anywhere where the stakes are high. It's not so much of a problem in entertainment or music or, anything creative. It's probably maybe actually a good thing. But for things where we really require high level of safety, accuracy, and trying to really minimize risk, it's a big problem. And so maybe we'll get into this a little bit, but actually there are ways to mitigate these hallucinations. And these are actually these things that Simone and I will be working on over the next few months. There's a certain framework called retrieval augmented generation, RAG, that essentially puts some brakes or constraints on these large language models and really forces them. It reduces their ability to sort of veer outside of a certain box or window of rules. Essentially you're tying what an LLM does to a structured database, a vector database. And by doing that, you're essentially forcing it to give you answers that are more based in facts than fiction. So, but yeah, these hallucinations are a problem that, we need to resolve if these models will be used more, in medicine and healthcare, at least.
Yeah, and if I can add to that, I think I heard an interesting discussion about the term hallucinations where someone was saying, why are we even calling it hallucinations? Technically, the models, all they do is hallucinate. It's more so how much creativity do you want them to have? There are other settings that you can adjust, such as the temperature. So how creative do you want an output to be? So you can adjust the temperature of the model to be more constrained versus more creative. But I think, quite frankly, just articulating that what these large language models are doing is predicting the next word. I just sort of like that framework of making sure that people understand that all they do is hallucinate. What we have to do as end users is to validate that data. And as Dan was mentioning, that makes it mission critical when trying to touch it and bring it anywhere closer to patient care.
Oh, that makes sense. What about something like bias? Is that a possibility with LLMs?
Yes, bias is also a concerning aspect of large language models, and quite frankly, any type of artificial intelligence and machine learning that's learned on any type of corpus of data. There's a phrase that everyone uses in data science: garbage in, garbage out. So if you're feeding it with garbage data and training a model on garbage data or biased data, the results that you will be getting will be informed by what you fed it. So just given the very well documented issues with bias in, say, clinical trials or is captured in the electronic health record, how are notes different for certain types of patient populations based off of biases that are among clinicians who are interfacing with these patients as well? So since we're trying to train it on data, we just have to be very particular and cautious about not trying to continue to reinforce biases based off of the data that are fed into the models.
Okay, understand. All right, so we've covered the advantages of using LLMs and a few of the disadvantages as well, or at least challenges. Now, you're conducting another study actually using LLMs in clinical practice. And I'm very curious about this. This sounds super fascinating. So let's get into this. Tell me about this study and what you're doing.
So that was a study where essentially Simone and I sent an email out to around 600 people and asked in our department, in lab medicine and anatomic pathology, and asked them, hey, would you guys be interested in this HIPAA compliant, PHI compatible version of a large language model that UCSF has supplied? And we got a really good turnout. And what we did was we essentially asked people to use this model, just as they really wanted to, as little or as much as they wanted to over 3 weeks. We gave them a pre-survey, sort of to get a little baseline information about the participants and sort of how comfortable they are with technology or large language models. Then we let them use the tool for 3 weeks, and then we gave them a post-survey. And then we also did focus groups. So we actually got 5 or 6 people in each session, or I think there was 5 or 6 sessions in a room, and we sort of held a focus group asking them more open-ended qualitative questions. And so that was a really insightful study. So I think a couple things came up. The first thing that came up for me, and Simone can add to this, is we found a lot of different use cases. So meaning there was a lot of different ideas people had on how to use a tool, what they would like to see, again, improvements, things that were sort of missing. So that was really insightful for us. I think just seeing the breadth and diversity of different applications people were using or wanted. So that was number one. Number two, and this goes back to some of the earlier kind of questions you were asking, Dennis. We did sort of around the limitations. So I think one of the questions we had asked in the pre-access survey was, how useful do you think this will be, this tool? It's called Versa. And I think actually most people, we had like a 5-point Likert scale. And I think most people, the aggregate was like a 4.2, where it's like pretty high, we're going to use it a lot. It's going to be great, whatever. So then after the 3 weeks, we gave the post access. And then even during the focus groups, I think that number dropped to like low 3s or even like high 2s. And so it's sort of a mismatch between expectations and reality. So actually people didn't really find it that useful. It was a little clunky. And again, just all these different reasons for it. But I think that was sort of, for me, the second takeaway was that there are limitations to these tools. There's room for improvements. And before it's widely adopted, hallucinations are part of it, but there's other issues that need to be resolved before these things really take off. And so that was a study that we did, I don't know, and Simone can add.
Yeah, so we were really just excited to use UCSF's enterprise stand-up OpenAI's Versa model that we deployed in a secure environment. So we had very interested faculty, staff, and trainees across pathology and laboratory medicine who were eager to use the technology. But what I should explain is the technology was truly very similar to ChatGPT, delivered in a chatbot format. So you would input prompt and then you'd get an output based off of your input. But in contrast to ChatGPT, different file types were not able to be uploaded. It was very sort of like a bare bones chatbot interface. So when it came to ultimately this being deployed and our departments using it, it was interesting. The faculty, staff, and trainees who we recruited, it was across a variety of technological sort of savviness, but we found that people who were more familiar with ChatGPT in terms of the extra bells and whistles that they now offer, they were just sort of craving more functionality. But as an enterprise, we were trying to roll out large language models in a safe manner. So we will obviously be behind all the functionality that something like ChatGPT have to offer. But it was really fascinating to see the use cases that people were ultimately deploying it for. Some of the different chatbot use cases included things like generating text, summarizing text, editing text, administrative tasks, coding, analyzing data, scientific knowledge, and then some non-work applications as well. So those are the large categories that we ended up sort of thematically hearing from our participants. But it was just an interesting experience to hear these use cases and also seeing people in the room reacting to other use cases. I remember someone was mentioning that, I had to write like a letter of recommendation, but I ended up actually writing it too long for the text box. They're like, and then I used the large language model to chop off 100 words because I was over the limit. And someone in the same room said, I have a grant application that I'm over the word limit right now. I didn't think to use it that way. So I think there is a hunger to use it and also to figure out good use cases for it. And as more people socialize how they're using it, Dan and I are curious to see if that also increases the use. Because sometimes I think there may be a little bit of a crisis of imagination with different technologies. If you don't know what they can be used for, it's almost hard to figure out the applications. So that's something that Dan and I are working on. If this is something that our department seriously wants to consider continuing to use and pursue, how can we better socialize different use cases that people have found valuable? So we have a lot of work ahead of us, but exciting work as well.
Okay, yeah, that does sound exciting. Just like real quickly, you've been saying that a lot of people were eager to use this tool. Was there anybody who were just like, nah, I don't need it?
Yes. Oh, and there were many people who didn't participate in the study.
Okay.
But there were also some people who they signed up for the study and they didn't end up using it, or they logged in once. And Dan, feel free to add to that.
No, yeah, I was going to say, the part that I didn't mention was really out of the 600, we only had, I think, 50 initial participants, and then we had some dropout. So that's the nature of these things. We work at a very busy academic medical center, and people are getting bombarded with emails and studies all the time. So, but yeah, even the people that did participate, again, just because of their and actually based on the focus group interviews, it actually wasn't because they didn't want to. It was a lack of time. That was the biggest cited reason for not using it.
That makes sense. All right, so it sounds like you've had some pretty promising results now. Where are you going to go from here with it?
Yeah, so from some feedback that we've had, we are trying to figure out how to better socialize more applications. So almost how do we create a community where we can learn from each other to figure out how we can augment and enhance our work experience. So that's one of them. And then Dan, if you want to speak to, I know you mentioned it earlier, the retrieval augmented generation project.
Yeah, this is something, Dennis, that we're really, really excited about. We just came back from this conference in Michigan, the annual Pathology Informatics Conference. And, this is really being touted as the only way. And again, I'm not an expert, so this is sort of me echoing things that I've heard from other experts. So, right. So, but this is sort of touted as the only way that large language models will be used in medicine. Again, and so these RAGs, this framework, again, it imposes some constraints on these large language models to, again, limit the hallucinations and really make it more fact-based. And so Simone and I have several ideas for how we can use this both in anatomic pathology as well as lab medicine. But, we have so much data, just so much, petabytes of data, honestly, between the two departments. And we want to train really essentially like a homegrown LLM that is integrated with this RAG framework, right? And so what we're envisioning is, imagine you're a pathologist or, a transfusion medicine doctor or whatever, anyone who works in these two departments, and you have the clinical question or research question, and currently you're going to Google or PubMed, and it's a little bit clunky, and it takes a while to maybe get an answer to your question. But, what if you could ask an application or a chatbot any question that you want related to your pathology or lab medicine, and it could reliably give you an answer, right? So that's currently not available because one thing to note, the Versa chat, this enterprise solution that Simone mentioned that we used for our study, it really is just Chat GPT. It was not trained on medical literature, it was not trained on pathology. So, Chat GPT really isn't. It's not great for medical stuff because it just didn't have really access to a lot of great medical stuff, right? So that's our goal here, is to really have a model that is specialized for pathology and lab medicine, a chatbot that can really be useful for any number of queries. And really not even, I think the thing I'm most excited about is currently, at least on the anatomic pathology side, and Simone maybe as she can talk more about the lab medicine, but on the anatomic pathology side, there's so many instances where we have a rare tumor, something that, we're like, oh man, I've seen this before. I don't know where it was. And so what people are doing now, the doctors, we each have not everyone does it the same way, but for example, one person may have an Excel spreadsheet. So since they started at UCSF, they started documenting all their rare cases or cool cases in an Excel spreadsheet, right? And so as an example, what this person may do is if they see a new rare tumor, they may go to their Excel spreadsheet, kind of manually look through and try to find, comparison, right? And so that's just one person. We have like 60, pathologists on the AP side. So, and none of these systems are talking to each other. We have one database, but it is very, very clunky to get any information. It would take days for you to get an answer with that database. It requires SQL queries, but I'm imagining a system, at least on the anatomic pathology side, where I could say, hey, I have a tumor that looks like XYZ. How many tumors have looked like this in the past? And we'll go through all of our reports, we're talking like hundreds of thousands of reports we have over the last several decades. It would go through these reports, find the cases, give you an output for the number. And again, you could just ask really any question you could think of, like, okay, what was the molecular pattern on this? Well, and so again, this is sort of pipe dream stuff where when I'm talking, this is what I wish would happen, but we're going to try to work towards this. That's my goal, at least on the AP side. Simone probably has ideas on the lab medicine side. So
Yeah, no, similar to what Dan was saying, using retrieval augmented generation, which is basically supplementing the large language model with a more defined data set. So you can, for example, give it a cohort or a corpus of documents to point to and to pull knowledge from to supplement the training that the large language model has had. The two different sort of methodologies out there to give more tailored responses from a specific knowledge base from a large language model are to do something like retrieval augmented generation, where you have your large language model and then you're asking it to sort of point to these documents for knowledge. Or you can do something called fine tuning the model, which is training the model on more domain specific knowledge. So fine tuning it, for example, on medical knowledge. That's very time consuming, very expensive, and very few institutions, it'd be more at the sort of corporate level that have the resources and the funding to be able to do something like that. So retrieval augmented generation is just the more accessible version of trying to tailor the knowledge base and hopefully tailor the outputs that you're going to be getting. So since pathology and laboratory medicine are very document-driven fields and very compliance-driven fields, I know there's been a lot of talk about how we can potentially feed our SOPs into a large language model through retrieval augmented generation to augment our ability to, for example, onboard staff or allow them to quickly figure out in this situation, what do I do, or what's the SOP, or for example, different accreditation criteria, different checklists that we follow, things like that. Just since we generate so many text reports, how can we leverage this technology to augment our practice and help us smooth over some pain points that we tend to have across all departments? We all seem to face this similar issues.
Okay, I like this. This seems like a lot of opportunities to apply these models. And this kind of ties into where I sort of want to finish the conversation, which is the idea of why it's important to embrace new technologies like large language models. And I'm curious, what are your thoughts on not only for yourselves, but for other people? Like, how do we promote embracing new technologies? Is it just a matter of trying to get people to be willing to use it, or is there something more to it than that?
Yeah, really, this is a really great question. I think out of all the industries, medicine's probably the slowest to embrace new technology, and there's several good reasons. So I think the first way I'd answer your question is, if we want people to embrace new technologies, we have to make sure that they're safe. So the reason that technology is sort of a slower adoption of medicine is because I think as a field, we're a little bit weary of sort of changing the way we do things because of the potential for harm. It sort of moves at a snail's. It seems like it moves at a snail's pace, but again, it's because we really don't want to do anything that could hurt people. That being said, it's not as if there's no mistakes that happen currently, right? I mean, that this is well known that there are medical errors that happen, and we address them as a field, but I think for whatever reason, there's more hesitancy of trying new things, even if they're promoted or marketed as being potentially error reducing. Again, so I think that's probably the first reason why most doctors would say they have reservations about technologies, because is it safe? After that, I think it's the usual suspects of behavior change. It's sort of getting comfortable with doing things a certain way, not seeing any real need to change. So that kind of stuff is more sort of broadly applicable to other fields. How do you get people to do things differently? It's a cultural issue, both broadly and you could have microcultures and things like that. So maybe some specialties are more accepting of technology. So I think radiology is a good example. That surgery is a pretty good example. I think they try new technologies a lot, new devices. I think for me, safety is probably the biggest reason many doctors would say that healthcare is a little bit slower to adopt new technologies.
Yeah, and my observation has always been that people are attracted to pathology and to different aspects of medicine because they want to help people. So I feel like we tend to be a passionate cohort of individuals who are very mission driven, who also have a tendency to brute force things because we're so passionate. So I think there is some times where we may actually default to working harder because that's who we are. We go the extra mile for our patients. We work harder. So there have been some interesting observations I've had where instead of working on efficiency, it's more so how do we get things done? Because there is generally an urgent need. A patient really needs you to go the extra mile, but we've created some cumbersome workflows to get to the end point. So sometimes I think that passion can almost work against us because we are so just focused on the immediate need of the patient care that's right in front of us. So I think it's also a balance of figuring out how do we strategically deploy this to make sure it actually fits into a workflow as well and accomplishes a specific goal. It has been interesting to listen to some critiques of large language models in terms of the moving the needle and what outcomes they can produce. So for example, someone I heard very cleverly argued, like, I don't think we should be investing a ton of effort into this technology if it's just going to make us go from writing mediocre emails to like a little bit better emails. Like, what's really the impact that that's having? How much investment should we be putting into that? Which I think is, it's a fair statement for sure.
Yeah.
But if we are going to embrace this new technology, especially among such a mission-driven and passionate cohort of individuals, I think people will be quick to see, what is the value proposition? How are you actually making the patient care and help the patient population that I serve? And so I think it's a matter of aligning and really finding where these solutions can be deployed, making sure they really fit into workflows and are quite seamlessly deployed. Because I think we're also coming from feeling a little bit burned by technology. There's been plenty of literature showing, for example, how the EHR may in some ways contribute to burnout, depending on how it's implemented, how workflows are designed in these electronic systems. So I think given that is an experience that we've also had, how are we going to effectively, efficiently, and comfortably deploy these technologies? Also, given all the caveats that Dan mentioned, making sure it's safe for patient care as well. So it's sort of making sure that all of those different things align.
Yeah, and it made me think of something. That last point, Simone, that's actually it's a good point I've been thinking about a lot recently. So I haven't really practiced medicine outside of the US, but I think in this country, at least, we have this tendency to, again, sort of go, always want more, always sort of do more tests. And so my worry that I'm having is these new technologies are supposed to make our lives easier, more, better workflows, faster, whatever. But I'm a little bit afraid that any time that we save for ourselves as physicians, we're just going to end up doing something else that's going to fill that. So rather than us actually feeling a benefit or some patients feeling benefit, it's just going to add, again, sort of like with the EHRs, it may go a different way than we think. And so I have some fear about that, in sort of the US, we do live in this very sort of capitalistic type of, economy. And it's not as if, free time is sort of valued here. It's sort of, if you have free time that is AI saved you, well, now you should use that to do something else. And so it's sort of just kind of snowballs.
Okay. Those are all of those are all very good points. This has been really interesting conversation. I appreciate the opportunity to kind of dig in a little bit more about LLMs, which is something that before this I didn't know a whole lot about. So I've learned something, a lot of things actually, and I appreciate both of you for being here tonight. So Dr. Simone Arvisais-Anhalt and Dr. Daniel Qazi, thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dennis.
Yep. If you're looking for another episode of the People of Pathology podcast to check out after this one, here's a clip from my interview with Dr. David Klimstra, where we talk about the application of AI in predicting HER2 expression in breast cancer.
So there's a pretty easy, direct line between the nature of the genomic alteration and the morphologic manifestation of results. AI enables us to potentially pull out things that pathologists may not have recognized yet, that are related to the underlying genetic alterations of cancer, but they're manifested in a change in tissue architecture or cellular structure. So to get back to HER2 expression, do we know why HER2 negative cases have a different histology than HER2 positive ones at a mechanistic level? Well, perhaps not. But the fact is they do. And AI was able to be trained to recognize those differences and predict which cases are truly negative.
You can hear more from Dr. David Klimstra in episode 163. All right, big thanks to Dr. Arvisais-Anhalt and Dr. Qazi. In this episode, we discuss the use of large language models, or LLMs, in pathology and laboratory medicine. Some of the benefits of LLMs are creating presentation outlines, data analysis, and translating pathology reports for patients. The idea of translating pathology reports is particularly interesting. As we know, these reports can use language that the patient may not understand. This can cause anxiety, confusion, or just misunderstanding. Using an LLM could provide patient-friendly interpretation of pathology reports, ensuring better communication and patient understanding. It's a fascinating idea. However, there are some challenges in the use of LLMs. Among these are hallucinations and bias. Hallucinations in LLMs refers to instances where the model generates irrelevant or inaccurate responses. Bias can happen depending on the data on which the LLM is trained. This can be related to gender and race, but also things like missing data or a small sample size. One of the ways to mitigate these challenges is through retrieval augmented generation. So this refers to integrating LLMs with structured databases and domain-specific knowledge. The work that Dr. Qazi and Dr. Arvisais-Anhalt have been doing at UCSF with LLMs is intriguing. As they mentioned, participants in their study came up with many unexpected use cases. So it seems we're only just scratching the surface of the capabilities here. Ultimately, the goal is to leverage LLMs to streamline processes, enhance decision-making, and improve efficiency in pathology and laboratory medicine. By embracing new technologies like LLMs, there is the potential to revolutionize how we operate, paving the way for more efficient and accurate patient care. As always, I'll have links in the show notes to everything that we talked about today, including the paper that we referenced. Don't forget, you can follow this show on Twitter and Instagram. I'm at People of Path, or just connect with me on LinkedIn. Thank you for continuing to share the show with others. Together, let's inspire the next generation of pathologists and laboratory professionals. This show is a member of Health Podcast Network. Thanks for listening. I'm Dennis Strank, and I'll talk to you next time on the People of Pathology podcast.